Okay, so let's dive into this. We are looking at a pretty significant debate that's unfolding right now in the Bitcoin community.
Yeah, it's all centered around this recent joint statement that came out from a group of Bitcoin Core developers.
And our source material for this deep dive, it's mainly an article, right?
Yeah.
One that covers the statement itself, but also pulls in, various reactions, criticisms from different people in the community.
Exactly. It gives us a really interesting snapshot, kind of a cross-section of the different viewpoints that are clashing right now.
Right. So our mission here, just to be clear for everyone listening, is to really get into this statement, try to understand the developer's perspective, at least as the source presents it, and then explore all those different viewpoints and concerns it stirred up.
Yeah. And it's important to stress, like you said, we're not taking sides here at all.
Not at all.
It's purely about understanding the different sides of this complex discussion based, strictly on the sources we've got.
Okay, so let's start with the statement itself. What's the core message? There were, 31 developers?
Yeah, 31 core developers signed on to it. And the source characterizes their message as basically a hands-off approach to how the Bitcoin network gets used. This is all happening amidst this ongoing argument about non-monetary uses.
A hands-off approach. So they're essentially saying, look, it's not really our job to decide how people use Bitcoin, just to, maintain the system itself.
Precisely. The statement, it was published on the Bitcoin Core website. According to our source, it has this key line. Let me see. Here. This is not endorsing or condoning non-financial data usage, but accepting that as a censorship-resistant system, Bitcoin can and will be used for use cases not everyone agrees on.
That feels pretty direct. Like they're acknowledging that if you build something truly censorship-resistant, you inherently lose some control over how it's used. People will do things you don't expect or maybe even like.
It really does. And they also argued in the letter itself that Bitcoin is fundamentally a network defined by its users. And that the core contributors, well, they're not in a position to dictate what software people want or what policies they should follow. They really emphasize that being free to run whatever software you want is the main protection the network has against anyone trying to force things.
Okay, so that's the stance from the developers as laid out in the source. But obviously this didn't just land quietly. It sparked a lot of debate, right?
Oh, absolutely. The source mentions that while many developers signaled support, with that ACK comment, which basically means acknowledged and approved in dev speak, there were others who strongly objected.
Right, the ACK's signal agreement. But what about the objections?
Yeah.
The criticisms?
Yeah, the criticisms highlighted in the source are quite pointed. Samson Mow, for example, he was apparently critical of the tone.
The tone.
Yeah, he said it was disingenuous to just say, it is what it is now, too bad. And he went further, claiming that core devs have been changing the network gradually to enable spam and now seem focused on also removing barriers for spammers. He even called the statement itself inappropriate.
Wow, that's quite an accusation. Saying developers actually helped create the situation they're now saying is just unavoidable. And he uses the word spam, which is obviously a loaded term here.
Very loaded. And the source does connect this criticism to a specific technical change, which is interesting.
Oh, yeah. Which one?
It mentions that back on May 8th, the Bitcoin Core developers decided to remove a long-standing limit on the size of transaction witness data. SegWit data, basically.
Witness data limit. Okay.
And the source says that some people in the Bitcoin community saw that change as the thing that technically opened the floodgates, allowing for much larger amounts of non-financial data to be packed into transactions, basically enabling these non-monetary uses Mo calls spam.
Got it. So the criticism isn't just about the statement itself, but it links this statement back to a prior technical decision, framing it as developers maybe trying to justify or normalize the outcome of that earlier change?
That seems to be one interpretation floating around, based on the source, yes. And there were other critics, too. Carl Horton is mentioned.
What was his take?
His view was very focused on the original purpose. He's quoted saying, "It's Bitcoin, not Bitbucket or BitStore or whatever general-purpose data store you have in mind. It's a peer-to-peer electronic cash system."
That really crystallizes the other side of the argument, doesn't it? This fundamental disagreement about what Bitcoin is or should be. Is it strictly electronic cash, or can it be this broader thing, like a data layer?
Exactly. That seems to be the absolute core tension here. And the developer statement also touched on network health and something called transaction relay policy, which also drew fire.
Transaction relay policy. Remind us quickly what that is. It's about how transactions get passed around before they're mined, right?
Yeah, basically. It's essentially the set of rules nodes use to decide which transactions they'll share with other nodes on the network before they actually make it into a confirmed block.
Okay, and what did the developers say their goals were for that policy in this statement?
Well, according to the statement, their main goals are things like predicting which transactions are likely to actually get mined eventually,
Makes sense.
speeding up the propagation, the spreading of those likely to be mined transactions across the network,
Okay.
and helping miners discover transactions that pay fees more quickly. They basically argued that trying to realistically guess what the network will mine is better than actively trying to filter out or discourage activities they called largely harmless technical activity.
So aiming for realism rather than trying to police the content too much at the relay stage.
That seems to be the idea. But even that rationale got criticized according to the source.
From who?
From another Bitcoin Core developer, actually, Luke Dush Jr.
Interesting. So disagreement even within the core developer group itself on this.
That's what the source says, yeah. Dush Jr. apparently criticized those stated goals pretty directly, saying they are basically all wrong.
All wrong. What were his specific points?
His criticisms, as reported, were that trying to predict what will be mined is actually a centralizing goal, which is a big concern in Bitcoin. He also said that just expecting spam to be mined is defeatism, kind of giving up, and that helping what he also calls spam to propagate is actively harmful to the network.
Okay. Wow. So that adds a whole other dimension. It's not just devs versus critics outside the core group. There are fundamental philosophical differences among the developers about what the goals of the network's infrastructure, like relay policy, should even be. Centralization versus, well, something else. Harm reduction versus neutrality.
Exactly. It really shows you how complex managing consensus and direction is in a project like Bitcoin, which is decentralized by design.
But the statement wasn't universally slammed, right? Did it have defenders mentioned in the source?
No, definitely not universally slammed. The source does quote Jameson Lopp, the founder of CASA, who defended the letter.
Okay, and how did he frame it?
Lopp basically framed it not as developers endorsing anything specific, but just as, well, as core devs being a group saying we can't force anyone to run code they don't like. Here is our thinking on relay policy and network health. Kind of a statement of position and reality, not an endorsement.
So more like a clarification of their limited role in current thinking, rather than a policy declaration for the whole network.
That seems to be his interpretation. And he also tackled the criticism that simply issuing a joint statement at all was somehow inappropriate for developers to do.
What was his point there?
He pushed back on that, yeah. He noted, according to the source, that in the past, when developers didn't coordinate their messaging and just spoke individually, they got criticized for having poor public relations.
Wow.
So his point seems to be, look, they try to communicate individually, they get criticized. They try to communicate jointly, they get criticized. It suggests maybe it's a bit of a no-win situation for the developer group when it comes to public communication.
Yeah. Sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario when they try to explain their position publicly.
That seems to be one way to look at it based on what Lopp said in the source, yeah.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit here. We've got the developer's statement laying out this view that, look, censorship resistance means accepting diverse uses. Users define the network. We can't force code on people.
Right. Then you have the critics, like Mow and Horton, who see these non-monetary uses as spam, arguing it harms Bitcoin's main purpose as cash, and some even linking it back to past technical decisions by devs.
And then there's this fascinating internal disagreement, highlighted by Luke Dash Jr., about the fundamental goals of things like transaction relay centralization concerns versus letting things flow.
It really boils down to these fundamental disagreements within the broader Bitcoin community about what Bitcoin is and where it should be going. It's this constant tension, isn't it, between the technical reality of a permissionless system, which is hard to control, and the very different visions people hold for its ultimate purpose.
Yeah. Are the developers meant to be neutral builders of a censorship-resistant platform, accepting whatever comes?
That's the stance they seem to be taking in the statement.
Or should they be, maybe guardians, trying to actively steer the network towards its perceived primary use case, peer-to-peer electronic cash, and perhaps filter out things seen as detrimental to that?
And that's what the critics seem to be pushing for in a way. It's a clash about what censorship resistance truly means in practice. Should it apply equally to all data, no matter what people think of its utility or its impact on the network's main function? Or should the primary function, cash, take precedence.
It really makes you think, what does this whole debate over transaction relay, over these different use cases, this tension between resisting censorship and fighting perceived spam, what does it really tell us about these deep fundamental disagreements over Bitcoin's ultimate purpose? And maybe more importantly, how should a decentralized network like this actually function when these disagreements arise?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the multi-billion-dollar question now.
Definitely something for you, the listener, to chew on as you think about all this. How does decentralization actually work in practice when the community itself doesn't fully agree on the destination?